Forget New Year, New You. This season is about slowing down, locking the doors, and cozying up at home with the one you really want to do nothing with. Your dog. After the holiday chaos, those quiet nights with a blanket, a podcast, and your pup feel like the reset you actually need. Ollie helps make those moments easier with fresh protein-packed meals made from real human-grade ingredients, so your dog can enjoy some quality comfort food too. Choose from 5 recipes and get a personalized plan for your dog's needs. Meals arrive perfectly proportioned with a scoop and storage container, so serving is fast and mess-free. And with Ollie's in-app on-demand health screenings, supporting your dog is easy, ensuring more cuddles for many years to come. Visit ollie.com/truecrime and use code TRUECRIME for 60% off your first box.
The Briley Brothers. The mere mention of them conjures a reaction from people. Any Richmond area resident who watched the news from 1979 through 1985 likely heard descriptions of the disturbing crimes they committed. More than 4 decades after their killing rampage, the Briley brothers almost seem mythical, but they were real people who randomly took innocent lives without any provocation. They murdered whenever they felt the urge. Linwood, James, and Anthony Briley made up the River City's most infamous killing gang of the 20th century. Police linked 11 solved murders to the Brileys during a 7-month stretch in 1979. But they were suspected of killing more, as many as 20. The oldest, Linwood, was charismatic and calculating. The second oldest, James, was intimidating and impulsive. The brothers convinced their youngest brother, Anthony, and a teenage neighbor, Duncan Meekins, to join them on a rampage that left a permanent mark on one of the South's most famously historic cities. The slayings weren't contained to one neighborhood or even one jurisdiction. The Briley gang left bodies in various parts of the Richmond metropolitan area. They didn't discriminate. They killed men, women, and children. Their victims were black and white. They murdered neighbors, and they murdered strangers. The Briley brothers had no modus operandi. They used handguns, rifles, knives, and baseball bats as weapons. One victim was killed with a cinder block. The Brileys often robbed, raped, and assaulted their victims before they killed them. Their youngest victim was a 5-year-old boy. Their oldest, a 79-year-old blind woman. Even while under police surveillance, the Brileys left death in their wake. As police watched one house, the 3 brothers and their accomplice were down the street, tormenting and killing a family of 3. That would be a recurring theme for the 2 oldest brothers, Linwood and James. Even under watch, they could be deadly, and they knew how to disappear. And they did. Today's case is one that's a little different than those I normally cover. But as soon as I heard about it, I was fascinated, and I think you will be too. This is Jillian, and in partnership with Law and Crime, you are listening to Court Junkie, episode 172. Before we get started, some descriptions of the murders in this episode are graphic. Listener discretion is advised. Linwood Earl Briley was born on March 26, 1954, to James and Bertha Briley. The couple welcomed another son, James Jr., on June 6, 1958. Less than 2 years later, the parents had their youngest son, Anthony. The working-class Briley family lived on 4th Avenue in Highland Park, a neighborhood in Richmond's North Side. James Sr. worked at a concrete block factory on School Street, a short distance from Virginia Union University, which was where Bertha worked as a food service employee. James Sr. was hardworking and straight-laced. Bertha was more personable and was known to have a softer sensibility. Virginia Union faculty and students alike adored Bertha Briley. One of those students was future Richmond Mayor Dwight Jones, who during an interview a few years ago described her as one of the sweetest ladies you'd ever want to meet. Those in the Highland Park neighborhood watched the Briley sons grow up. Nothing appeared unusual about the way they were raised or how they behaved while they were kids. Bertha seemed to be a doting mother. Both she and her husband provided a loving and nurturing home for their sons, according to many who were close with the family. The older neighbors in Highland Park knew the two older Briley brothers, Linwood and James, known by his friends as JB, to be willing helpers. The older Briley sons would mow their neighbors' lawns or pull their trash cans to the curb. Linwood in particular impressed people with his intelligence. His father would often brag about his gifted oldest son. People started to notice a change in the Briley brothers by the time Linwood turned 15. They became notorious bullies at John Marshall High, and it seemed they were constantly looking for trouble in and out of school. They weren't just getting into fights or being disruptive in class. They were vicious. They settled scores with their fists. They preyed upon weaker people. Those who actively tried to avoid confrontation with the brothers got the worst treatment. Linwood, in particular, often would look for ways to manipulate people. JB and Anthony seemed to be under the spell of their older brother. Linwood also had a strong influence on an impressionable teenager in the neighborhood by the name of Duncan Meekins. Those who investigated, prosecuted, interviewed, or conducted mental examinations on the Briley brothers later described Linwood as the most dangerous because of his high aptitude, but JB was the one people feared more. By comparison, JB was taller, stronger, and more volatile than his older brother. Joe Jackson was a longtime reporter for the Virginian Pilot in Norfolk.
But usually it was James, who was better known as JB, who was the enforcer, the more violent one. He kind of radiated a aura of threat, I think, and people were intimidated by him, and they were scared of him, and they either tried to get in his camp and do what he said, or they just tried to steer as far away from him as they possibly could.
One prosecutor said JB had the face of a man who was born for the electric chair. In simple terms, Linwood was the brains and JB was the muscle. Linwood knew how to get his way because he had a strong, intimidating sidekick he could lean on. While living in Highland Park, the Briley brothers owned a collection of what they called predatory pets: boa constrictors, piranhas, and tarantulas. There were reports that they would gleefully hold a mouse by its tail and dangle it in front of their pet snakes and watch the reptiles swallow it whole. The teens' troubling behavior took a toll on their parents' marriage. James Sr. and Bertha separated while the older brothers were in high school. Bertha eventually moved out of the house on 4th Avenue, so Linwood, JB, and Anthony all lived with their father. James Sr. reportedly feared for his own safety while living under the same roof as his sons. When it was time for James Sr. to go to bed, he would sometimes lock his bedroom door from the inside with a padlock. While the Briley brothers were teenagers, they had a neighbor, Orlean Christian, who also lived on 4th Avenue. The 57-year-old was newly widowed. After she had lost her husband, those who were close to Orlean worried about her. She took the loss of her husband hard. Her children were grown, and she wasn't used to being an empty nester. On January 28, 1971, while in her backyard hanging wet laundry on a clothesline, Orlean fell to the ground and died. Orlean had heart trouble, so her family and loved ones concluded that the stress brought on by the sudden death of her husband had led to a cardiac arrest. The funeral home that handled the burial arrangements returned Orlean's bathrobe to her family. Orlean had been wearing it when she died. Family members noticed a small hole and traces of blood below one of the sleeves. A funeral examiner was asked to look at Orlean's body more closely. He discovered what appeared to be a small bullet wound below her armpit. Orlean had been the victim of a homicide. A Richmond police detective, Norman Harding, took a 4x4 and sawed it down so that the length was the same as the victim's height. He brought the piece of wood to Orlean's property and stood it on its end in the general area where Orlean had last stood. Detective Harding had tracked down the ambulance driver who found Orlean's body. The driver told him where she had been lying, and that's how he determined where Orlean had been standing when she was shot. Using the board and factoring in the bullet's trajectory, Detective Harding scanned the area and discovered that the rifle round could have only been fired from one spot, a window from the Briley home, a window from Linwood's room. A search warrant was served at the home and a rifle was found. The murder weapon belonged to Linwood. Detective Harding would eventually be one of the leading investigators in the series of Briley killings that would take place 8 years later. During an interview with a psychiatric evaluator following his arrest for Orlean Christian's murder, Linwood said he knew his victim had heart trouble, adding that she was going to die soon anyway. Linwood spent just 1 year at a reform school for killing his neighbor. A couple years later, soon after J.B. turned 16, he too would be arrested. In 1973, J.B. robbed a convenience store. Police responded and spotted him running from the scene. A police officer started chasing J.B., who whirled around and fired his gun at him. No one was injured from the gunfire, but J.B. was apprehended later and charged with attempted murder of a law enforcement officer. He was sent to a reform school and was paroled after a year. Here's J.B. talking to reporters during a prison interview years later, admitting to the crime.
I did a wrong, which was in 73. I armed robbed a store. I shot at a police officer. I made a mistake, and I went to prison.
By early 1979, all three Briley brothers were in their 20s. Their tag-along, Duncan Meekins, was 16. The Brileys still lived at home with their father, but their neighbors no longer called upon them to cut their grass. They preferred to keep their distance. Dale Brumfield is a Virginia native who was an undergrad student at Virginia Commonwealth University during the late 70s and early 80s. He would later become a journalist and published author. He has done a lot of research on the Briley brothers.
Oh, they were vicious killers. I mean, what was so scary about the Brileys was that there was no rhyme or reason to their crimes. They seemed to have there were no demographic. There was nothing common to the murders. They were all over the place. And that's what made it so scary, because it was purely random.
The citywide terror that the Brileys inflicted began on March 12, 1979, about 8 years after Orlean's murder. On that day, the Brileys knocked on the door of William and Virginia Boucher. The couple's house was a block from Hilliard Road in Lakeside, a census-designated community in Henrico County, located northwest of Richmond and about 7 miles from where the Brileys lived. It remains a mystery why they chose that house in that neighborhood. 59-year-old William Boucher answered the knock at the door, assuming it was the paperboy showing up to collect his payment. Instead, he saw Linwood standing on his front porch. Linwood told William he had car trouble and needed to borrow his phone to call AAA. William said he would make the call on his behalf and asked Linwood to hand over his AAA card. Linwood pulled out a card and handed it to him. William opened the screen door to grab the card, at which time Linwood grabbed the door, pulled it backward, and forced his way inside. He also pulled a gun on William and told him, "Get your ass back in the house." William's wife, Virginia, heard the commotion. She entered the living room and saw that Linwood had a gun in one hand and a knife in another, which he had placed against her husband's throat. The rest of the gang entered the house after Linwood. One of them warned Virginia that if she screamed or made any noise, her husband would lose an ear. The Bouchers were forced onto the floor in separate rooms and were tied up with rope. Duncan Meekins was responsible for tying William. William asked him to loosen the rope because it was cutting off his circulation. Meekins did as he was asked. After the couple was bound, the Brileys and Meekins went through each room in the house, ransacking it and placing valuables into pillowcases. They also doused areas of the house with kerosene. Some of the fluid was purposely poured onto William's legs. Linwood lit a match as he and the others were leaving the house. He dropped it on his way out, and the fire was set. Virginia yelled out to her husband, telling him the intruders were gone. William wiggled his hands free and rescued his wife before the flames overtook them. William later said he and his wife would likely be dead had he not convinced Meekins to loosen the rope around his wrists. William and Virginia Boucher were the only known victims of the Brileys who survived. William would tell the Richmond Times-Dispatch 30 years later that he was doggone lucky not to have been killed that day. The Brileys stole the couple's car and later abandoned it. Among the items they stole from the house were television sets, a .32 caliber handgun, and a police scanner. 9 days after the Boucher attack, on March 21st, the Brileys forced their way into another home with murder on their minds. They entered the Richmond home of Michael McDuffie, a vending machine serviceman. They battered him and ransacked his house. This time, they made sure their victim was dead. Linwood was insistent on not leaving any witnesses behind. Michael McDuffie was fatally shot. 10 days later, on March 31st, Linwood shot and killed 28-year-old Edric Elvin Clark. Unlike most of their victims, Edric was known by the Briley gang. Edric was reportedly involved in a drug dispute with Duncan Meekins, one that Linwood wanted to resolve with murder. His body was found lying near a road in the east end of Richmond. On April 9th, the Brileys struck again. They drove around and spotted 76-year-old Mary Gowan, leaving her babysitting job on the city's north side. They followed her for miles until she arrived home. They then stormed into her house and terrorized her. They beat, raped, and shot her. They ransacked her home, stole several items, and left Mary for dead. She fell into a coma at the hospital the next day and died a few weeks later. 3 months later, on July 4th, the Brileys noticed a teenager on a bicycle near Linwood's parked car. It was 17-year-old Christopher Phillips. They suspected that Christopher was going to try to steal Linwood's car, so they surrounded him and dragged him into a nearby backyard. All 3 brothers wrestled him to the ground. Christopher screamed for help, and that's when Linwood grabbed a cinder block and hit him in the head with it. The Brileys waited another 2 months before striking again. On the night of September 14th, which was a Friday, 51-year-old John Harvey Gallagher was playing a gig with his band at a local honky-tonk dance hall known as the Log Cabin, located on Jefferson Davis Highway in the south side of Richmond. Johnny G., who played bass, was best known around town as a daytime DJ for WXGI, a local country radio station. In between sets at the Log Cabin, Johnny G. decided to give his dry eyes a break from the thick secondhand smoke, so he walked outside. Linwood, JB, Anthony, and Duncan had been cruising around that night, looking for more victims. Finding no good targets, they decided to park somewhere and wait for an opportunity. They were parked next to the Log Cabin when they saw Johnny G. walk outside through a rear door. The Brileys made their move. Johnny G. was abducted at gunpoint, forced into the trunk of his own Lincoln Continental, and driven to Mayo Island along the James River, a famous river that cuts through the city of Richmond. Johnny G was forced out of the trunk and stumbled as he climbed out. While he was trying to regain his balance, he was shot in the back with a rifle. Johnny G's body was dragged towards the river. The Brileys pushed him down a steep slope into the water, and the body floated downstream. His corpse was discovered by fishermen the following Sunday. His head and shoulders were submerged, and the rest of his body was tangled in a tree that was hanging just above the water's surface. His car was located about a mile from where his body was found, parked on a gravel slope behind a recycling plant. The CB radio inside the car had been stolen. Johnny G had several items on him that were stolen during the kidnapping, including a turquoise ring that he often wore. His jacket and belt were found in an alley near the club, and some blood was left behind, indicating that he had been battered by the Briley gang before he was forced into the trunk. Richmond police also found blood inside the car. Johnny G was a bachelor who was close to his family. His music career led him to collaborate with the likes of Chet Atkins and Sonny James. His broadcasting career began in 1959, and he was a well-known radio personality in Richmond at the time of his murder. The news of his death shook people. No one had any idea why Johnny G was killed. It was also clear from the evidence that he was made to suffer before he was fatally shot. Then, a vital clue was discovered. A fingerprint was pulled from one of the door panels. On September 30th, 16 days after Johnny G's death, the Brileys went driving around again looking for more victims. They saw 62-year-old Mary Wilfong heading home from her private nursing job. As she was about to enter her apartment, the Brileys attacked her. JB beat her to death with a baseball bat. They removed items from her apartment and fled. She would be the 6th murder victim of the Brileys. Their remaining victims were closer to home. On October 5th, the Brileys entered a house on 4th Avenue, located 2 blocks from where they lived. The home was owned by Blanche Page, who was 79 and nearly blind. The second victim in that attack was Page's boarder, 59-year-old Charles Garner. Page was beaten to death with a baseball bat upstairs. Detectives would later say the blood spatter that was left behind was unlike anything they had seen in their careers. Charles was stabbed to death downstairs, and his death was even more gruesome. He had various sharp instruments sticking out of his body when police showed up, including a large fork and a pair of scissors. It was reported that at least 5 knives were used to kill him. One detective, J.T. Woody, who would later become Richmond sheriff, said the Brileys kept stabbing Charles as his body lay on the floor. They stabbed him with so much force that the tip of the blade left indentations in the hardwood. 2 weeks later, on the morning of October 19th, J.B. appeared before a judge. He was still a parolee for the attempted murder and robbery he had committed while a juvenile 6 years earlier. No one in that courtroom had any idea of the murderous violence he had committed during the previous 7 months. Police were investigating the murders, but JB had not yet been fingered as a suspect. The judge asked JB whether he was on the straight and narrow and worthy of remaining out of jail. He assured the judge that he was law-abiding and deserved to be a free man. Hours after JB walked out of that courtroom, he would take part in the Briley gang's bloodiest massacre to date. JB's older brother, Linwood, was already under scrutiny due to his well-documented history of violence. Police also learned during their investigation that fingerprint found inside Johnny G's car the previous month was a match to Linwood. Richmond detectives set up surveillance inside a van they had parked on the same block as the Briley home. Linwood and James noticed the van, and Linwood was immediately suspicious of it. The brothers approached the van for a closer look. While standing just a few feet from it, they started arguing. Linwood was reportedly convinced the van was an undercover police vehicle and that he and his brother were being watched. The tinted windows made him suspicious. JB believed otherwise. Both of them walked up to the van and started pushing against it. The entire van started shaking. Linwood was still convinced there were cops inside, so JB pulled a gun from his waistband and fired it once towards the sky and once towards the ground. If there were any police officers inside, why weren't they jumping out with their guns drawn? JB asked his brother. That seemed to give Linwood some reassurance. The two returned home. In reality, JB wasn't right. There actually was a police officer inside that van, but she was the only one sitting inside, and there were no other officers around. She wasn't about to come outside and take on both killers by herself. JB was armed. Linwood may also have had a gun. The officer also worried that associates of the Briley brothers might show up without warning. She had no advantage, no element of surprise, so she played it safe and remained inside the van without making a sound. The Brileys eventually got into Linwood's car and drove away. The van never moved from that location. Linwood and James met up with Anthony and Duncan later that night, and the four went on the prowl, searching for more victims. Once again, they didn't wander far. Harvey Wilkerson and his wife, Judy Diane Barton, lived around the corner from 4th Avenue. Judy's 5-year-old son, Harvey Wayne Barton, also lived with the couple. Judy, who was 23, was 5 months pregnant. Harvey Wilkerson was 1 year older than 25-year-old Linwood. He knew the Brileys well. They had been friends for years. Some have suggested that the brothers already had Harvey in mind as a potential victim because they knew he dealt drugs and assumed he had stacks of cash in his home. Harvey was outside the night of October 19th when he saw the Briley brothers park their car down the block. Harvey knew the Brileys were violent and had grown to fear them, just like others in the neighborhood. He went inside his house and bolted the door. Linwood watched Harvey retreat into the house. Prosecutors later said Linwood and JB hated seeing fear in other people. It drove them to commit murder. The gang walked to the front door and banged on it. Linwood threatened Harvey and ordered him to open up. He did. Immediately, he was overpowered. Linwood, JB, Anthony, and Duncan all entered the home. Harvey, Judy, and her young son were bound with duct tape and gagged. Linwood raped Judy in the kitchen, and after he was done, Duncan then raped her. Linwood grabbed some of the family's personal belongings and told JB that he was in charge of the house. Linwood left with the stolen items, and JB ordered Anthony and Duncan to cover the adult victims with sheets. JB shot Judy 5 times in the head. He turned to Duncan and told him it was his turn to kill someone. He hadn't been a trigger man yet. Duncan grabbed a pillow, pressed it against Harvey Wilkerson's head, and fired, killing him. The boy, Harvey Barton, was killed last. JB shot him in the head. Police were nearby and heard the gunfire. They still had Linwood under surveillance, but had lost track of him. Those officers near the scene couldn't tell where the shots were coming from, so they frantically searched the area. From a distance, they saw JB, Anthony, and Duncan running along the street. They then lost track of them. The Briley brothers regrouped a short time later, and they all took a ride in Linwood's car. As they cruised around, the killers listened to the dispatch reports over the police scanner that Linwood had in his car. It was the same one that had been stolen from the Boucher house 7 months earlier. The bloody scene inside the Wilkerson home would go undetected for 3 days. The day after the killing, J.B. brazenly returned to the home to steal more items. The brothers had only gotten away with $100 in cash the night before, so he went back and removed a television from the house. No officers were around when he returned. Police were later called to the scene after a neighbor noticed a stench coming from inside. J.B. had apparently left one of the doors open. What added to the scene was that the Brileys had let loose Harvey's pet snakes. When investigators responded, they had to contend with snakes slithering across the bloody floors. Additionally, the family had a pair of Doberman puppies. They were running loose inside and were leaving bloody tracks throughout the house. There wasn't a room inside that home that didn't have traces of blood. Animal control had to be called to corral the snakes and dogs. The members of the Briley gang were the prime suspects in the triple murder. Police went to the Briley house to serve arrest warrants, but Linwood and Duncan had left shortly before they arrived. The Brileys' father, James Sr., had gone with them. Police eventually spotted Linwood's car nearby. As police were following him, Linwood seemed to know he was being followed. He was hearing the dispatch reports over the stolen police radio in his car. Linwood led police down several streets before the pursuing officers made the decision to force him off the road. Linwood's car rammed into a pole. Linwood jumped out of the moving car before impact and tried to make a run for it, but was captured. James Sr. and Duncan suffered minor injuries from the collision. Duncan was taken into custody after he was treated at a local hospital. The other two Briley brothers, J.B. and Anthony, turned themselves in after learning they were wanted. Duncan Meekins was interviewed for about an hour. The pressure mounted and he cracked. He described in detail to detectives every robbery, rape, attempted murder, and murder he participated in during their 7-month spree of terror. Duncan's stories shocked investigators. Mary Wilfong, the 62-year-old private nurse who was killed 3 weeks earlier, was murdered in Henrico County. The Richmond police weren't even handling that case. A lot of work had to be done to collect evidence from all the killings described by Duncan. They needed more than just the teenager's statements. Warren Von Schuck, one of the assistant Commonwealth attorneys assigned to the Briley case, later told the Richmond Times-Dispatch, quote, "Evidence had been misplaced in some of the cases. Forensics had been misplaced or not done because there had been no realization that there was a suspect or that we were going to make an arrest in those cases. We had to go back and redo a lot of different things." The Brileys were more tight-lipped during their police interviews than Duncan, but they didn't necessarily give investigators strong denials. One of the detectives who was brought in to interview Linwood was Leroy Morgan. The 43-year-old detective happened to be close friends with Johnny G., the country music DJ whose body was dumped in the James River. Detective Morgan noticed something on one of Linwood's fingers. It was Johnny G's turquoise ring. He knew it was his friend's ring because he was with him when he bought it. Linwood mouthed off to Detective Morgan during the interview. Another detective stood between the two and told Detective Morgan to leave the room and cool down. The trials for Linwood and JB were packed with spectators. During both trials, Duncan took the stand and described the scene inside the Wilkersons' home. He said JB had already fatally shot Judy Barton, and he was standing over her lifeless body. He recalled hearing JB tell him that it was his turn to get one. Duncan told the jury, "So I stuck a pistol to a pillow, put it to the man's head, and fired." Richmond Circuit Judge James Wilkinson who presided over both men's trials, called the killings the vilest rampage of rape, murder, and robbery the court has seen in 30 years. Others would call it the worst rampage Richmond had seen in 100 years. Richmond by then had developed a reputation of being one of the country's most violent cities. It had one of the highest per capita murder rates in the United States during that period, and about 1/5 of the city's murders in 1979 were committed by the Briley gang. Richmond had 3 local news stations and 2 daily newspapers in 1979, and all of them kept airing or publishing stories about the Briley brothers. The stories about the way they killed, how they terrorized their neighbors, owned predatory animals as pets, and were devoid of any remorse for their victims, became ingrained in the memories of Richmonders who saw and read those news stories.
The Brileys were built up into monsters. I mean, they were bigger than life.
Investigators tried to nail down what motivated the Brileys to cause so much carnage. One informant reportedly told police that the Brileys wanted to become hired hitmen. They wanted to show people that they could kill without hesitation. One reason for the brothers' insistence on killing every victim was Linwood's unwavering rule of never leaving witnesses behind. Referring to the 2 older Briley brothers, Warren Von Schuck told one TV news reporter, quote, "If you had 25 cents in your pocket and they wanted it, they'd just cut your throat and take it. And where that comes from, I don't know." In the end, Linwood was convicted of 6 of the 11 killings linked to the Briley gang. JB was convicted of 7. Anthony Briley was not sentenced to death because he wasn't the trigger man in any of the slayings. He received life in prison plus 119 years. The Commonwealth of Virginia has since abolished parole for crimes that were committed after December 31st, 1994. Convicted felons still in prison for crimes committed prior to that date remain eligible for parole. That includes Anthony Briley, who reportedly has been denied parole at least 10 times. Duncan is also serving a life sentence. The prosecutors who obtained death sentences for Linwood and JB have recommended to Virginia parole board officials that Duncan be released. They said the cases against the Brileys never would have been made without his cooperation. Before his death in 2010, Norman Harding, the retired Richmond police detective who investigated the Brileys, also testified on Duncan's behalf. Duncan, who is now in his late 50s, remains housed in an undisclosed prison under an alias. Virginia corrections officials decided to do that for his protection. Inmates who snitch on other inmates are not usually safe in a prison's general population. According to media reports, Duncan was most recently denied parole in 2009. Family members of Harvey Wilkerson have said they're opposed to his release. Robert Rice, one of the prosecutors in the Briley case, has said that he and Von Schuck promised Duncan from the outset that they would advocate for his parole as long as he cooperated with the investigation. Both prosecutors have lived up to that promise. After the news broke that Duncan's parole had been denied, Rice sounded off during an interview with the Richmond Times-Dispatch. He suggested that Duncan might have been better off not saying anything. He told the newspaper, "What benefit has he gotten? If I were Duncan Meekins, I'd have to wonder why I did what I did." Neither Duncan nor Anthony Briley have experienced freedom since their arrests 42 years ago. But ironically, the same can't be said of Linwood and JB. Linwood and JB were sent to death row in 1980. There was no other death row like it anywhere else in the world. The Mecklenburg Correctional Center was located in Southside, Virginia, a short drive along U.S. Route 58 east of Boynton, a town of about 450 residents. The federal highway closest to the prison is the longest numbered route in Virginia, stretching for nearly 500 miles. It goes east and west from Chesapeake to Cumberland Gap and basically runs parallel to the North Carolina border. The death row design at Mecklenburg was simple. It had two sections, C-pod right and C-pod left. The cells were the same size and all looked the same. There were 6 cells upstairs and 6 more downstairs. So there were 12 cells per section and 24 total. The separate sections faced each other on opposite ends of the day room. There was a plexiglass enclosed control room in the middle so that the guard on duty could see inside both sections and scan every cell door by simply turning his head. From the start of his incarceration, Linwood Briley took charge in the C-pod. A month later, in March 1980, J.B. moved into the same cell block. Linwood's reputation inside the prison was the same as it was on the outside. He was a natural leader. He rarely lost his temper. He had a quiet charisma and made sure he was in control of himself and others around him. J.B.'s reputation in prison was also the same as it was on the outside. Loyal to his brother, but intimidating to everyone else. While the two were on death row together, J.B. was Linwood's enforcer. The two of them ruled the death row pod. The Briley brothers' reputations preceded them. They had killed many more victims than their counterparts on death row. The other inmates knew who they were dealing with, and if there was ever a hope of challenging the Brileys' superiority, it was dashed quickly. In 1981, a year or so after his arrival, J.B. made an attempt to escape death row. Those plans were thwarted after it was discovered that someone, a girlfriend of his, was trying to smuggle in weapons. J.B. served a brief stint in solitary confinement, but the incident was soon forgotten by prison officials. The security at Mecklenburg was only as good as those who enforced it, and there never seemed to be good enforcement. One day in June 1983, a new death row inmate, Dennis Stockton, was moved into the cell block. Dennis was convicted in a murder-for-hire plot in Stuart, Virginia, a small town in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Dennis would keep a diary of his experiences at Mecklenburg, which would later become the most insightful document detailing what life was like inside Virginia's death row. His diary was the basis of a book co-written by Joe Jackson. The first inmate to approach Dennis was Linwood. A day or so after Dennis arrived, Linwood picked up a chair from the day room, placed it in front of Dennis's cell door, sat in it, and introduced himself. Dennis knew who Linwood was, even though Dennis lived 200 miles southwest of Richmond. The Briley gang's crimes had made news all over the state. Not long into the conversation, Linwood handed Dennis what looked like a rolled-up cigarette. Dennis took a drag and realized it wasn't tobacco he was smoking. It was Colombian reefer. It was Dennis's first realization that day-to-day life on death row wasn't so strict, and the one in charge wasn't wearing a guard uniform. According to Linwood, the guards knew about the pot. They also knew about the homemade wine being made in the cell block. They just didn't care. Linwood would later say, they would rather see us doing that than sawing on the bars. That's how it reportedly worked on death row. The guards would allow for some rule breaking as long as it eased some of the tension. If there were no fights to break up, the guards were willing to placate the prisoners. Dennis and Linwood became fast friends. The two of them shared an interest in marijuana. Dennis would write in his diary that Linwood and J.B. were in charge of much of the drug trade inside the prison. Linwood's entire cell was reportedly littered with contraband. He'd sell cigarettes, bootlegged wine, drugs, and just about anything else. He would tape provocative photos of women on his walls, photos he would receive from female admirers on the outside. Dennis relished his friendship with Linwood. Like his friend, Dennis had arrived at Mecklenburg with a less than stellar reputation. The guards were leery of him immediately. Dennis had an expression that could be described as menacing. One person who worked on his defense said Dennis had no chance at an acquittal because his eyes revealed so much evil. He compared making eye contact with Dennis like making eye contact with Adolf Hitler. Dennis was similar to J.B. He was fierce, intimidating, and confrontational. The two didn't compete for alpha dog status inside the pod, though. Dennis conceded that role to J.B. Dennis once got wise to J.B.'s penchant for cheating at cards. Had it been anyone else in the prison, even Linwood, Dennis likely would have said something, but it was J.B. Dennis decided it was best to pretend he didn't notice. Dennis may have had a friend in Linwood, but he never got close to J.B.
Dennis felt that that if there was one person in death row that could easily kill him, it was J.B.
It was one day in October 1983 when Linwood first mentioned breaking out of prison to Dennis. The two were playing Scrabble in Linwood's cell, something they often did together. Linwood brought it up casually. He asked Dennis, "You ever think of leaving here?" From that moment forward, Linwood and Dennis had a lot of conversations about leaving Mecklenburg. It didn't take long before they both agreed that the best way to do it was by tricking the guards. That seemed easy enough, considering how lackadaisical they were. Linwood considered Dennis to be a useful accomplice. He and the other death row inmates knew nothing of the geography outside the prison. They had no idea where those roads led to. While an inmate, Dennis had been driven to Danville for court hearings and to South Hill for doctor appointments. He knew the lay of the land. Dennis and the Brileys served on death row the same time as another high-profile inmate, Joe Giarratano. Joe had a history of crime, violence, drug abuse, and mental problems. At 13, he tried dying by suicide. His father had abandoned him, and he wouldn't meet him until he was an adult. The two finally met in Florida. Both of them were inmates at the infamous Union Correctional Institution outside Stark. Joe was taking after the father he barely knew. Not long after his return to Virginia, Joe was convicted of killing a 44-year-old woman and her 15-year-old daughter inside their home in Norfolk. Joe was the mother's roommate. The home had been known as a party house where visitors regularly came and went. One night in February 1979, police found the bodies of the victims. They had been fatally stabbed, and the daughter had been raped. Joe was reportedly in a drug haze. When he woke up and saw the two bodies, he believed he had committed the murders, even though he had no memory of doing so. He panicked and took the first bus out of town. He rode it all the way to Jacksonville before deciding to turn himself in. Joe gave a series of interviews to detectives, and his stories kept changing. Joe's guilt has reportedly always been in question. No evidence was collected at the scene of the crime because police stopped the investigation after Joe admitted to committing the murders. Joe waited less than 2 days before his scheduled execution date in June 1980 before filing an appeal. As soon as he did, his execution was put on hold. He remained on death row while his appeal went through the proper channels. There are two other inmates I want to touch on here, Earl Clanton and Derek Peterson. Earl was convicted of a 1972 murder of an elderly New Jersey woman. While out on parole for that conviction, he was arrested on an unrelated felony charge and jailed in Petersburg, Virginia, a small city about 25 miles south of Richmond. While jailed and awaiting trial for that charge in April of 1980, he escaped from the Petersburg jail and remained at large for 7 months. One night in November of that year, neighbors heard screams from the home of a local librarian's house. Police arrived and saw the female victim dead and covered in blood. Police also found Earl hiding underneath the victim's bed. Petersburg police detectives said Earl had burglarized and attacked his victim. They said he tied a belt around her neck and stabbed her several times. He had barged into her home looking for money. The jury agreed with police and prosecutors, and Earl was sentenced to death. He arrived at Mecklenburg on March 13, 1981. He was 31. He was hyperactive, temperamental, and in great physical shape. He harbored bad feelings towards white people, but mostly maintained good relations with Dennis. He did so because Earl idolized Linwood, and he didn't want to make an enemy of one of Linwood's closest friends. Linwood knew he had control over Earl. All he'd have to do was whistle, and Earl would come running to him. Earl had a nickname on death row. The other inmates called him Goldie. He was like Linwood's pet golden retriever. As for Derek Lynn Peterson, he was arrested in February 1982 in Tidewater for the murder of a 45-year-old grocery store manager in Hampton. He walked into the office cubicle of the Pantry Pride store, grabbed checks and cash, and shot the store manager once in the stomach. The man died from his wounds, and months later, Peterson was convicted and sentenced to death. Derek was one of Earl's closest friends on death row. His cell was next to Earl's. The last inmate I want to talk about here is Willie Lloyd Turner. Willie was convicted and sentenced to death for the 1978 slaying of a jewelry store owner in Franklin, about 40 miles west of Norfolk. Linwood and James Briley, Dennis Stockton, Joe Geritano, Earl Clanton, Derek Peterson, Willie Turner, and a few others decided to all get together and hatch their plan, a plan to escape from Mecklenburg. Preparations for the escape began in January of that year. Dennis had some post-trial hearings in Richmond, so he had to spend a few weeks at the jail there. When he returned to Mecklenburg, he realized something was different. The inmates were getting more serious about escaping. Linwood asked Dennis whether he was still interested in getting out. In that moment, Dennis assured Linwood that he was. Linwood spelled it out for him. They were planning to overtake the guards, steal their uniforms, put them on to disguise themselves, and walk out of the prison. Dennis nearly laughed in Linwood's face. He thought Linwood was making it sound too easy. He also knew it would be a challenge to avoid getting shot by one or more of the tower guards. And then what would happen if they did get off the property? They'd be so close to the North Carolina border, they'd have to contend with police and National Guard forces from both states. To Dennis's surprise, Linwood actually had specific plans already laid out, and it was clear that a great deal of thought was put into them. The inmates knew the guards' shirts, waist, and shoe sizes. They found out the designated radio codes for each guard who worked in the building. They also knew where the riot gear was stored inside Building 1. The inmates knew they needed weapons. Willie Turner had that covered. He was a prolific knife maker, and he knew how to conceal them. By late February, the inmates collected enough items to make all the homemade weapons they needed. During the coming weeks and months, Turner used nail files, metal scraps, and other materials and converted them into blades. Turner and the other inmates stashed the weapons in various places, including the hollowed-out legs of the chairs, tables, and beds located throughout the pod. Dennis helped Linwood and the others smooth out some of the smaller details. Before long, mostly everyone in the pod had an assignment and knew what to do. That included those inmates who were not planning to run. All of the inmates wanted to be seen as team players. Their lives depended on it. If Linwood and JB suspected someone was going to snitch, that person would get an early execution. The first formal meeting was held in the day room on March 5, 1984. The inmates pushed 2 tables together and sat down. they had the presence of mind to stack some law books onto the tables to give the impression they were going over their appeals. One guard was sitting just 30 feet away and watching TV, while another was glancing over from the control room. But neither had any idea what the group of inmates were actually discussing. Not every loose end was tied during the meeting, and the escape itself was still more than 3 months away. But everyone agreed that the best way to get through the administration building, the most heavily guarded area of the prison, was by making the guards think that there was a bomb inside the prison. The guards, for as long as any of the inmates could remember, never had to contend with any sort of bomb threat. The inmates knew they needed the guards to be confused, overwhelmed, or both. They figured a bomb hoax was the best way to make that happen. Everyone was assigned a job. Dennis was the getaway driver, and his participation was critical. No one else on death row, other than Linwood, had ever owned a driver's license, and it had been a long time since Linwood had driven. The last time was when he rammed into a pole, trying to get away from the Richmond police. But perhaps the riskiest assignment fell on Earl Clanton. It was his job to figure out how to enter the guards' bathroom and hide there for an extended period. The bathroom was close to the control room. Someone had to enter that room in order to open all the pod doors. So Earl was to hide inside the bathroom, wait for an audible signal, burst out of the bathroom, and enter the control room. While inside, he then had to work the buttons properly to unlock all the cell doors. Their plan was coming together, but could it actually work? One day in March, word got out of a surprise inspection of the cell block. Inmates referred to them as shakedowns. JB had a shank in his cell, and he was paranoid that it would be found. If so, it likely meant he'd be placed into solitary confinement for months. JB called over a guard and convinced him to fetch the weapon from its hiding place. The guard found the weapon and stuffed it inside his sock. As it turned out, there was no shakedown. The guard eventually put the weapon back where he had found it. Originally, the plan was to escape on April 15th, tax day. There were 10 inmates who were involved in the escape, and at that point, all 10 were determined to go. But as the April 15th date neared, a couple of them were getting nervous, while a few others were bugging the Brileys and others about tagging along with them on the outside. The Brileys weren't planning on letting anyone join them. 2 more men arrived that spring on death row, Willie Leroy Jones and Lem Davis Tuggle Jr. Not long after Lem Tuggle moved in, he was pulled to the side by the Brileys and a few other inmates. They asked him whether he wanted to take part in the escape. He enthusiastically agreed to do so. The same went for Willie Jones. Willie was 26 years old when he was sentenced to death. He was convicted in the double murder and robbery of an elderly Charles City County couple. The slayings occurred on May 13, 1983. Willie shot 77-year-old Graham Adkins in the head, and then asked his wife, 79-year-old Myra, to pray for him. After she did so, Willie shot her. He stuffed Myra into a closet and stole $30,000 from a bedroom safe, and then set the house on fire. An autopsy revealed that Myra had survived the shooting, but died from smoke inhalation from the fire. Willie knew Graham and Myra after they had offered to help him while he was out of work. Lem Tuggle of Smith County in Southwest Virginia had a Jekyll and Hyde personality. He was a laid-back country boy, but his darker, more violent side would come out whenever he drank excessively.
You know, if you met him at a bar or something like that, or or at a fishing camp or something like that, I think he'd just be a likable, good old boy. But Lem could, if you got Lem drunk and he was around a woman, then that woman stood a very good chance of being killed.
Early during his adult life, Lem was given an undesirable discharge from the military for going AWOL too many times. In 1971, he then raped and strangled 17-year-old Shirley Brickey. In 1983, he was paroled for that crime, but less than 4 months later, he was arrested for the rape and murder of 52-year-old Jessie Havens. She was shot in the chest and thrown down an embankment. He robbed a store after murdering his second victim, and when he was pulled over by deputies, he admitted to the robbery. When he heard a call about the missing victim come over the deputies' radios, he confessed to that crime too. He then showed them where he put the body. He simply told them that he was tired of running. One night while in prison, Lem lay in bed with a handheld tape recorder that he snuck inside death row. Here he is talking about the inmates' plan to escape. This recording is from YouTube, and I'll provide the link in the show notes so you can listen to it in its entirety.
And from March until May, we planned and we talked and we discussed. We had escape committees. We had a little committee that any kind of problem that popped up, you had to clear it through the committee before you could take any kind of action at all, because the escape overrode everything here. There was nothing more important than the escape. So that's the way we had it set up. And no personal conflicts, no nothing overrode the escape.
On April 14th, one day before the scheduled escape, Linwood told Dennis that they would be delaying the escape one more month. He said his brother, JB, needed more time. He felt they were still short on weapons. They also decided it would be better to carry out the plan after the post-dinner rec time rather than earlier in the day. It meant there would be fewer guards on duty, and they could escape when it was dark outside. Dennis was disappointed because he had already packed his overnight bag of supplies. The change of plans inevitably meant that Dennis would change his mind about joining the escape. What swayed him was his renewed optimism regarding his appeal. His accomplice in the murder-for-hire plot, the one accused of hiring Dennis to kill the victim, had his case thrown out before it went to trial. Dennis was feeling more confident than ever that he could win an appeal, and he didn't want to do anything to jeopardize his chances. Dennis told Linwood he was pulling out. Linwood was disappointed that he had lost his driver, but he didn't get angry. JB, however, had a different reaction. Already suspicious of Dennis, JB was told by one of the guards that rumors were circling around that the inmates were planning an escape. He openly accused Dennis of being a snitch. Dennis furiously denied it. As it turned out, 2 death row inmates, identities still unknown to this day, actually did tell their attorneys about the escape plot. Those attorneys then went to the Attorney General with that information. The Attorney General's office called the warden at Mecklenburg. On the morning of April 18th, 3 days after the originally scheduled date of escape, a riot team stormed into the pod and checked the cells. Nothing of significance was found, nothing that seemed to confirm what the Attorney General was told, that several death row inmates were plotting a breakout. On April 20th, the unit was placed on lockdown. The inmates weren't allowed out of their cells except to take a shower, and that was every other day. One by one, a death row inmate was brought into an interview room for questioning. Each one came away realizing that officials knew very little about what was really going on. They were fishing for information, mostly asking questions about hidden weapons. Every inmate remained tight-lipped. The lockdown was lifted after 1 week. Following the scare, the inmates on death row who were planning to break out were more restless than ever. JB was keeping a close watch on everyone. Earl Clanton openly said he would kill the snitch if he ever found out who it was. Meanwhile, the plan was never altered. A new date for the escape hadn't been agreed upon, but circumstances dictated that it needed to happen on May 31st.
They come by that afternoon about 3 o'clock, and told me the escape was on for tonight, and this was on the 31st. And the reason being is because we had just gotten word from Building 5 that they were getting ready to kick off a ride over there. And, of course, if they had kicked off their ride before we did our escape, of course, the escape probably would not work.
It was time. Lem shaved his beard. Willie Turner made sure the weapons were ready. Earl was getting anxious. Dennis wrote down everything he observed in his diary. The Briley brothers were about to become more infamous than ever, and fear was about to grip Richmond all over again. Next week, in part 2.
I think I got a phone call from a friend of mine, as I recall, and he said, have you heard the news? And I'm like, what's that? And he said, well, they've had a prison break in Mecklenburg. And I'm like, you got to be kidding. That's not possible.
And that's all for today's episode. A special thank you to Joe Jackson and Dale Brumfield for helping us out with this episode. You'll be hearing even more from them next week. These episodes on the Briley Brothers were researched and written by Tony Holt. Don't forget to follow Court Junkie on Instagram @Court Junkie, on Twitter @CourtJunkiePod, and on YouTube at youtube.com/Court Junkie. To hear these episodes without the ads or to check out bonus episodes, head on over to CourtJunkie.com/support to see my Patreon options. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.